So let me first, by way of introduction, say that we're delighted to have Mary McAleese here with us this fall and part of the academic year. She was the Irish president from 1997 to 2011, as many of you know. She earned her law degree in 1973 at Queen's University in Belfast. And after that, she worked as a barrister before serving as the Reed Professor of Criminal Law at Trinity College. Following a brief career in radio as a radio journalist, she returned in 1987 to Queen's University to become the first female pro-vice chancellor of that important and storied university 7 years later. Having defeated the Taoiseach Albert Reynolds for the Fianna Fáil presidential nomination, she went on to win the national election, taking office in November of 1997. Only 4 presidents of the Irish Republic have completed 7-year terms, and none more eventful than that of Professor McAleese, the first native of Northern Ireland to hold that office. As the eldest of 9 children, I knew we had something in common. In a family compelled to move from their North Belfast home in the wake of intense sectarian violence, she well understood the complexities of loyalist and nationalist concerns and worked quietly but significantly on negotiations leading to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. As head of state, she welcomed Ireland's presidential residents, such notables as President Barack Obama and the Queen of England, whose visit at Mary's personal invitation was truly historic. She has been a key voice and concern for the rights of gay people and for gender equality in Ireland, and she served as the first legal advisor for the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform from 1975 to 1979, which sought to decriminalize homosexuality in Northern Ireland and in Ireland. She has also spoken out about the plight of gay persons in Ireland, particularly gay youth, a group with high suicide rates. As a Catholic and overwhelmingly Catholic Ireland, she has also addressed the emotional toll of teaching experienced by many youth in Catholic schools in Ireland. She has also publicly expressed her support for gay marriage and for the ordination of women to the Catholic priesthood. We are also thrilled to have Professor Paul Petit here with us today. He's an assistant professor of counseling psychology at the Lynch School of Education. As many of you know, he has written extensively about the psychological effects of bullying and homophobia on adolescents and how to prevent bullying and homophobic attitudes in adolescents. He has also received numerous awards and honors from the American Psychological Association for Best Science in the Society of Counseling Psychology in 2012, and an early career award for his contribution to LGBT counseling psychology. He's been involved in advocating for LGBT youth through the submission of an invited research brief solicited by the United States Commission on Civil Rights, and also contributed to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Commission on GLBT youth. So we're delighted to have both of them here. The format for today is that they will each speak to you briefly, and then they are eager to engage you in discussion and dialogue. So welcome to Boston College for this event, and thank you both.
Okay, I'll take over, will I?
Please.
For a moment. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Looking forward to a really good session, and so happy to be here in Boston during this beautiful fall weather, and to see the magnificent array of colours that God has gifted us. You've heard a little bit about my background. I was born in Belfast, in a part of Belfast that today, like when I was growing up, has 70% unemployment. So that gives you some idea of the kind of background I came from. My parents are working class. My father left school at 14, got his first pair of shoes at 14. He had, like all his brothers and sisters, grown up in the west of Ireland, went to school barefoot, did everything barefoot. And then at 14, his father took the donkey and cart into the nearest town and bought a pair of shoes. My father wasn't with him, even though the shoes were destined for him. He always tells the story that he was 26 before he grew into them. So he came from a rural Irish background, small farm. My grandfather would say that he had enough land for 2 cows and enough rain for 202 cows, because it was, after all, Ireland. So my father translated to Belfast, where he met my mother, who was a hairdresser. She had left school at 15. They were cradle Catholics, as I was, Anne. And their lives were effectively dictated by and the shape of their lives was dictated by the church. They would not in those days have regarded it as being dictated by the church. They sure do now. But it's 9 kids later. And they belong to a generation that did not have the chance for education. I belong to a very fortunate generation because in the late 1940s in Northern Ireland, there was a change in the law, and second level education and indeed third level education were made much more accessible. In fact, second level education was made free for everyone, and third level education was grant aided. So my generation became what were known as, well, Seamus Heaney. Any of you are into Seamus Heaney's poetry? He described them brilliant. He describes that change. I belong to that generation where there was a real sea change. Instead of being quietly accepting of, of what we were told to do and just simply doing it like automatons, we now had education. And we were what he calls intelligences brightened and unmannerly as crowbars.
I love it.
And we had to be, because there were a lot of obstacles still to be removed. Obstacles to the creation of a culture where people listened to what others said, as opposed to talking down to them and telling them what they would think and what they would do and how they would behave. We still are not there yet. I mean, we're trying to change this big ship, this culture of talking down to a culture of listening up. But I was part of that and became very much involved then in civil rights movements because, of course, as a Catholic, I belonged to that culture which was largely excluded from jobs, excluded from politics, from political life, because we lived inside a Protestant political hegemony. And we had to fight for the right to vote, we had to fight for the right to jobs. By the time I came to be the Pro-Vice Chancellor of my alma mater in 1987, the university that I had gone to as a student, that university was the subject of 2 major reports, one of which pointed out the tiny number of Catholics who held jobs throughout the university. The most senior person in the administration, most senior Catholic in administration, worked in catering, and was one person. We had very few Catholic professors, very few Catholic staff, and yet the university had 60% Catholic students. And the community at that stage had 40% Catholics. Nowadays, much more than that now, about 45%. The other thing that we did badly was we were very poor also in the recruitment of women. It's very interesting always to me, where there's one prejudice, it always has a first cousin, maybe even 2, 3, 4 or 5. And so women, and so my job when I went to Queen's in 1987, one of my principal jobs was to try and see if we could change that track as well. And I found one of the great joys to me, though it wasn't all joy, let me tell you, was to try and change that culture. And to change culture, you had to change people's way of thinking. And so I was involved in the culture change that led now to a situation where we actually have a fairly decent number of Catholics employed, haven't been so successful on the women front, which tells me how deeply embedded how much more probing and digging we have to do to get to the bottom of that. So I come from a culture, just very briefly, what infuses me, what is if you like, the salt of my being, is my faith. I was very fortunate to grow up as a cradle Catholic, to learn of the great commandment to love one another, to be well catechized in that, and to see it in action in and through my family. I'm not just the oldest of 9 children, but I'm also one of 60 first cousins. My mother and her brothers and sisters between them had 60 children. You heard that right, 60. My family thought they had to increase, multiply and fill the earth entirely by themselves. And they're still trying very hard. We're now into the next generation, has about 156 as of yesterday here in Boston. The next of them born in Brigham's down the road. That experience of growing up in that very big clan with very closely connected to one another, seeing the wonderful, majestic difference that God created And learning to love in that clan, I think, was probably the best education I ever got and the best catechizing I ever got in love. But the other thing that I got from my father was a love of politics, and in particular, a belief that no matter how difficult things are, no matter how excluded you are, you look for the space that you can worry and work, and you look for the legal space that you can worry. You do not, no matter how frustrated, no matter how angry, no matter how provoked, you don't use violence. So, and that came to him, strangely enough, partly from the gospel, but also partly from a man called Daniel O'Connell, my great hero and the leader of the Irish people in the early part of the 19th century, the man who got Catholic emancipation for Catholics who were excluded from every darn thing at that point, and who was a Catholic and who was going to benefit from it. But he was the Nelson Mandela of his era. He was the champion of Russian Jews. He was a friend of Frederick Douglass here in the United States and a champion of American slaves and their freedom. So he was a man whose focus was the dignity of the human person. And that's kind of where I placed myself. I looked at the people I felt who were excluded, who weren't listened up to, who were talked down to. Gay people, women, poor, excluded, and in so many ways. And that's where I think that's where I set my life's course. So anyway, that's me. Enough. Enough. It's yours now.
I can't follow that.
Of course you can. Of course you can.
Well, I had the privilege of actually talking with Mary yesterday for a very extended period of time, and it was truly inspiring to hear more detail about what she just shared, and I would love to hear more. And I also had the privilege of getting to ask my questions first of her before we open it up for a large part of this discussion for audience questions. But a number of things that Mary brought up really rang and resonated for me based on some of the research that I've been fortunate to do around bullying, especially homophobic bullying, and looking at the experiences of LGBT youth, both those who are bullied and those who are very resilient and who are really contributing solidly. And one of the things, as it happened, is that in March of this year, we had a convening of researchers across the U.S. and also limited international representation to look at issues of homophobic bullying and exclusion. And there were representatives from Ireland that were there who were representing a group called Belong To, which was in some ways very similar to what we have in the States, such as gay-straight alliances in schools, and includes individuals who identify as LGBT but who also identify as heterosexual and who are strong allies. And the reason that really resonated with me and being able to talk with Mary is that in hearing what she has done, I truly do see Mary as a very strong ally and supporter for LGBT people, both youth and adults. And it is very inspiring, especially to hear what she's done historically. As Brenton was saying, and also as what Mary was saying, since the late 70s and early 80s. And we can certainly think about what our historical context was in the 70s and 80s as it related to LGBT issues and gender issues. And so to hear Mary talk so strongly about that and having such a central role, I think is really telling of just what she has done for LGBT people globally. And we have a lot that we can take from that and use here in the States. In terms of the work that we're doing here and how that maps onto work in Ireland, here in Massachusetts, we've made concerted efforts to establish anti-bullying legislation, and especially legislation that is enumerated and includes attention to LGBT youth, racial ethnic minority youth, gender and religious minorities, and immigrant youth. And again, that resonates with a lot of what Mary has done in looking at multiple marginalized groups and seeing some of the commonalities of oppression and how it affects groups similarly. And so I guess coming from that and having the experience here in the US and really wanting to hear more about the commonalities and cross-cultural similarities, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask Mary and to hear more about this. And we've heard some of the personal kind of factors that motivated your involvement in this area. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the personal journey that you've had and what inspired your involvement in both women's rights and LGBT rights, and also where you see yourself going.
I think the major prompt for me, quite apart from the gospel to love one another, is indignation. And I use that word really rather than anger, just indignation. Just a couple of cameos. I was, I think, 14 or 15 when I first said, I was a schoolgirl in a Dominican convent in Belfast, and I first said that I thought I would like to be a lawyer, following in the tradition of Daniel O'Connell, I would like to say, but actually no, it's much more likely that it was a TV series at that time, I think something like Ironside. But anyway, anyway, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I said this at home in the presence of our parish priest. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Father Ted. You've seen Father Ted. There's a character in it called Father Jack. You know Father Jack? Foul-mouthed, bad. No, anyway, Father Jack is in Father Ted. The character Father Jack is based on him, is based on Father Honorius. Now, he was never that bad, actually. But the character is played by his nephew, Frank Kelly. He was a Dubliner living and working in Belfast, an appalling snob, but a funny, a wonderful, wonderful man in many ways, but a typical Dublin snob. And you can imagine working in a working class area in Belfast where this jumped up upstart of a 14-year-old none of whose family have ever been next or near a university, even physically never to mind to go there as a college or as a student, is saying she wants to be a lawyer. And his immediate reaction was, just very gently, he said to me, "Oh, you can't do that," he said. 2 reasons. 1, you're a woman, and 2, nobody belonging to you is in the law. Now, my mother treated priests with a reverence and a deference that is quite typical of her generation. I mean, she did everything except kiss their hems and ring bells when they came to the house. And we were taught that same reverence and respect, and I never forget her reaction. Her reaction was instant, and it was almost violent. And she just said to him, "You get out." And she said to me, "And you do not listen to him." And that's the only career advice I ever got from my mother. I think it was probably all I needed, and it worked. But subsequently, I learned to be more understanding of where he was coming from, because 2 years later, to finish out the story, I got into law school. He was the first person on our doorstep to congratulate me, incidentally, and take me to dinner. That unfortunately also happened to be the night that Civil War broke out on our doorstep, literally. But I got into law school, and the first book we were given, top of our reading list, a book called Learning the Law by Glanville Williams, one of the most eminent jurists of his generation. Now, this is, okay, it's the last century. I know that, Okay, it's the last century. And it's, 1969. Do not do the maths. And so this book, I was an eager student. I raced down to buy it to the bookshop, and about 3/4 way through it, there is a chapter which is ominously entitled Women. Now, I went back to the beginning to see, was there another matching one called Men? But no, naturally enough, there wasn't. And in that chapter, from a very eminent jurist, we are told, why are you going to law school? Sure, everybody knows that women should not be there. It's a pointless education for women. They're never going to get jobs as lawyers. Their voices don't carry. He never heard my mother. So they full of generalities and really rather craven, paternalistic nonsense. But he did say at the end that, at the very end of this chapter, which was very, very discouraging of women from going to law school, that at the very least, if we insisted on being there, one of the good things to come out of it was we would be sure that we would get a good husband out of it. So I married a dentist just for spite. Fuse point blank to marry a lawyer. So that was, and then 4 years later, meanwhile, we had begun the consciousness, of women's rights, and equal opportunity. And 5 years later, I was called to the bar of Northern Ireland. That's when you're admitted as a lawyer. And there were 3 women. We were the first 3 women to attempt to practice law in Northern Ireland, God help us, as barristers. And we were given as a gift a hardback copy of Glanville Williams by the Lord Chief Justice, who saw nothing at all wrong about continuing this same attitude. So those attitudes are embedded. I'm also very conscious. Had I applied, incidentally, in 1969 to Boston College, what do you think might have happened to me? Anybody know? 1969.
Nursing or education.
Yeah, they didn't admit women till 1972. 1972, folks. Okay, it's still the last century, but it's not that far ago. It's not that long ago. So, and then that's part of my personal journey, and indignation that there would be, before I ever got onto the face of the earth and before I ever formed my views or decided what I wanted to be, that other people had already corralled or crippled my life by deciding for me what I was capable of doing. Frankly, I heard some resonances of that in Pope Francis's talk 2 weeks ago on Mulieris Dignitatem, and I have a lot of hope in Pope Francis as a person who could help us maybe lurch in a more generally acceptable direction in the church. But if you look at what he said 2 weeks ago, I heard that same paternalism. I heard that same patriarchy. He talks about 2 dangers in relation to women that operate, 2 opposites he describes, that destroy, these are his words, destroy woman in her vocation. I actually don't know what he's talking about, quite frankly. I really don't. But this is what he says. He talks of the first danger, which is reducing maternity to social roles, and the other danger is in the opposite direction, and here are his words, that of promoting a type of emancipation, which in order to occupy spaces taken from the masculine, abandons the feminine with the precious traits that characterize it. I frankly think that is balderdash. And there's no other way that I can describe that, because it's exactly the kind of language that I have been hearing, deeply embedded in paternalism, deeply embedded in a kind of attitude to women, which is the same attitude to gays, the same attitude to children very often, and the same attitude that was faced Daniel O'Connell when he argued for Catholic emancipation. Some people think they own this thing called rights, that it's a great big box and they own it. And we who are outside the box, we have to beg them for bits from inside the box, and that they have the right to dribble them out to us, and we should be so grateful when they dribble them out to us. Actually, I don't buy that. And I do not buy the idea, nor do I buy the idea, without being involved first in a discussion, which I've never been involved in, I don't know if anybody in this room's ever been involved in, a discussion about what spaces are exclusively for the masculine. And what is it about that word that I find, it just provokes indignation in me. I want to have a discussion about this. I don't want to be told before we get there, here's how it is. I want a discussion before we get there. So that's where I started off from. I become involved with gay rights very simply because I grew up in a convent school. I have to admit to being a really very slow starter here. I was at university in my second year before I knew there was such a thing as a homosexual. Can you imagine that now? It wouldn't happen to kids nowadays. But that's how naively we were reared and educated. And it took me to come to work in San Francisco to meet a colleague with whom I worked and who became a great friend, who told me of the dreadful, dark space that he occupied as a gay man. And I was devastated to think of the loneliness and the isolation and the unhappiness of this really good and decent person. And so I decided, well, I wanted rights for Catholics, I wanted rights for women, but in the O'Connell tradition, I had to be aware of other people's pain. So as soon as I got to Dublin in 1975, along with my colleague David Norris, we formed, around his kitchen table, the first campaign for gay rights. And I'm proud to say that I was the first person to raise the issue on radio ever in Ireland of the possibility of gay marriage. And that was back in the 1970s, incidentally. And what interested me was nobody jumped up and down with anger in Ireland. There was virtually almost no response. Now, it might have been that they thought, actually, that'll never happen. It's just nuts, you know. But I don't think so. I really don't think so. Because a number of years later, in 1984, when the Catholic Church, the Irish Catholic Church, was appearing at a giant political forum organised by the government called the New Ireland Forum, the then Cardinal and the Archbishop of Dublin asked me to be one of the 2 lay people representing the church. A 6-person group represented the Irish Catholic Church. They knew that I was an advocate of gay rights. And in fairness to them, they never once said to me, if anybody asks a question about that, you're to say this. Or if anybody asks this is an open public forum on television. They never said to me, if that question is asked, you must give it to a bishop. They gave it. They knew who I was and what I was, and they were content with that. I would say if the forum took place 20 years later, during the time of John Paul or Benedict, there isn't a mission I would have been asked to be on it. But that was then. I'm also very gratified that we were just talking about this yesterday to Paul. We have, in all the opinion polls, we now have gay partnership in Ireland, of course, civil partnership, and we are probably on the way now to gay marriage. In that, we have a constitutional convention which advised the government lately that it supported gay marriage. We know that 84% of our population supports gay marriage, and our government now has promised to respond within 40 days to this advice from the convention. And we do not have in Ireland a single political party which opposes gay marriage. And that will tell you something about the nature of the discourse that has been going on in Ireland, a faith-filled country, a country of people that are dominated by the Spirit of Christ and with a very strong Christian heritage, but who they also know bigotry when they see it. They know, they know it. We know it. We've been victims of it for centuries. And we can translate it from one group to another. We can see its insidious spores at work. So that's how I've come into these issues, really, and have been very much involved. And in recent years have become again indignant about my church's failure to deal, and indeed all the Christian churches, but particularly my church, because it is the major contributor to education in Ireland. The vast majority of children in Ireland will go to Catholic schools. The biggest killer of young men in Ireland between the ages of 15 and 25 is suicide. Not traffic accidents, not disease, it is suicide. Who are the most at-risk group within that 15 to 25-year-old male age group? Who commits the greatest number of acts of self-harm and attempts at suicide? Young gay males. They will have gone to Catholic schools, and they will have grown up in Catholic homes. They'll have gone to clubs. And I'm not suggesting that the schools are entirely to blame or the church is entirely to blame, but what it teaches and how it teaches it, in my view, conduces to hatred. It does not conduce to love of the human person. And it conduces to self-doubt, to conflict, to secrecy. If you've grown up and you've heard your father or your brother or the rugby club being, homophobic, in jest very often, making jokes about gay people, and suddenly at 14 and 15, you discover, oh my God, that's me they've been talking about. Can you imagine the black, dark space that pitches you into in your head and in your mind? Can you imagine the danger of that and the difficulty of that? And then we wonder why we have these statistics. And I think that we have. I went to see the nuncio, the nuncio about this, the new nuncio, Monsignor Charles Brown. And I was deeply, deeply worried about it. And his answer was, what do you want us to do? You want us to change 2,000 years of tradition and teaching? And I said, actually, if it's wrong, yes. I said, you have done that already. You might remember you had 2,000 years of teaching of anti-Semitism that ended in the Shoah. You changed that very rapidly. You had centuries of teaching that unbaptized children could never go to heaven. I think of my grandmother who went to her grave having buried a child that was unbaptized. And I think of the grief that she carried to her grave through this ridiculous nonsense that is no longer taught. So I said to him, we do change. When we get things wrong, we change them. And there is growing evidence that our people believe this to be wrong. So that's where I come from.
Wow.
I feel like we should just have a moment to take that in. It's both moving and refreshing to hear someone who's been in your position and is in your position to say something so candidly like that and so strongly.
Well, I'm not looking for a job anymore, so I'm not looking for a vote, so I can say what I like now. But I always did anyway.
Oh, so to speak up, I'll ask one more question because I have no doubt that everybody in here would love to grab the mic. But maybe building on what you just spoke about in school-based issues. And here in the States, we know from national surveys that up to 85% of LGBT youth report experiencing some form of victimization at school. And so school-based discrimination is especially central to LGBT youth's experiences, and we see that connected to all sorts of outcomes, as you mentioned, suicidality risk, but also academic dropout, and even more future kind of goals and intentions. I'm wondering, having been in your position and where you see things going, how do you work within that system to affect change and also to change that system at the same time? Because you had mentioned both of those earlier as well.
Well, all I can say is what I've chosen to do. I mean, I think, you bite the Yorkie bar off in small pieces. You don't stick it all in your mouth at one time. And, I believe in the old, the Italians have a great expression, piano, piano. Yeah. Which basically is stick one foot in front of the other and keep going. And so that's small steps. And I just try to do, we have a government at the moment in Ireland which is addressing the issue of bullying in schools and addressing it very openly on the issue of homophobia. In the past, I think we have tried to deal with, because of the overwhelming control and influence of Catholic schools, we've come at this issue dealing with it in terms of bullying, but with almost that don't ask, don't tell kind of attitude in relation to homophobia, hoping that the generic bullying would cover it, but without actually dealing with it as an issue because of the conflict with church teaching. So this government, our current government is heading into it face on, dealing with it as it should be dealt with, quite openly. In other words, and also creating space for listening and giving young people the right to talk and discuss, not to have stuff superimposed on them, but to listen while they tell of their own lives. Because we, of course, I come from a tradition. I don't know what it's like here in the States, but I come from a tradition, a bog standard Catholic tradition in Ireland, which is not unlike the Protestant tradition in Ireland, which was about recruiting me from the cradle, from infancy, to a magisterium worldview, and a political view for that matter too, a view on politics, a view on religion, and I was not to be encouraged, in fact to be discouraged from ever expressing my own view, unless of course it was completely foursquare with the magisterium. And I'm not just talking about the church magisterium, I'm talking about the magisterium of politics also, the magisterium of history. So now I'm retired now 2 years, and I decided that I was going to sort of pitch the rest of my life and my work in my church, but also looking at how we can use law to effect change. So I decided to become a canon lawyer, much to the annoyance of a lot of canon lawyers. Oh God, not again, here she comes, oh mother of God. Anyway, so the last 5 years now, I've been studying canon law, and I got my master's in canon law, I got my licentiate in canon law, and now I'm doing a doctorate in the Gregorian University in Rome in canon law, and my subject area is children's rights in canon law. That's exactly where I'm pitching myself, trying to look at ways in which we can use systems that we have. First of all, that we can probe those systems for the ways in which they close down the kind of necessary debate that we need to have, the ways in which they close down space for people who are entitled to have their voices heard, and how can we use that same system to open up debate. For example, in the Code of Canon Law, the 1983 Catholic Code of Canon Law, there's an article in it, there's one of the every little section in it's called a canon, every little law is called a canon. One of the canons is Canon 212.3. Most people never heard of it. I certainly never heard of it growing up. Nobody drew it to my attention. But it says that we are entitled, as members of the Christi Fideles, we are perfectly entitled, and indeed have a responsibility, if you don't mind, to tell our sacred pastors our views on things. Jeez. Well, nobody told our sacred pastors that, I can tell you. And they certainly didn't tell me that. But I think we need to be told it. And most importantly, we need to use it. And I'm not just including adult voices, I'm talking about the voices of children. To respect the spirituality of children. I think that if we had been listening to children, if we'd had a culture that said, tell me what happened, tell me what you're thinking, tell me what you're doing, tell me why you're cross, tell me why you don't want to go to school. If we'd had that culture, we wouldn't have had the mess we had with, regrettably, I think, with abuse. Had we empowered children, given them the language, helped them to talk, please God, there's a generation coming that will be encouraged to talk. But we ignored kids, and not just in the church, incidentally, right across the international spectrum politically. It's only really since the 60s and 70s, and with the advent of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that we've actually just begun the embryo of a child-centred focus. And that will change things. It will change the discourse, just like the focus on women's rights changed the discourse, started a new journey, a new trajectory, just like the discourse on gay rights is changing the journey. I don't know about you, but even though I talked about gay marriage 30 years ago, I really don't know that I believed it would ever happen. And then the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, Why? Because the discourse continued and because it had integrity. It had integrity. It was being probed and it stood up. It stood up to all sorts of old biases and old opinions, and tradition, so-called, just started to fall away because tradition turned out to be what tradition often is, just, a bundle of stupid stuff that we keep on doing and repeating because we haven't the imagination to do something different. And sometimes tradition is good and sometimes it's wonderful, and sometimes it is horrific in its consequences.
We stand to benefit greatly from that, what we do here in the States. Well, I had a number of other questions, but I want to make sure that we have time for everyone else to ask questions. So I don't know how we might.
Mary said she wanted to
strategize that.
actually acknowledge, so if you would stick up your hands if you have a question, and remember the mic is this way. Or comments.
Tom, off you go.
Mary, you make me proud again of my Irish heritage. Thank you so much. You're an inspiration. A little BC footnote that the struggle for marriage equality in Ireland and for gay rights and so on had some leadership from two of our graduate students, Senator Kay Zapone and Anna Louise Gilligan.
Two great friends of mine in Ireland.
Yeah, both of whom did their doctoral work with us here. I suppose I'm so taken with your phrase, how do we get them to stop talking down and begin to listen up? How do you do that with magisteriums, magisteriae, church, state, culture? What's I suppose that they're looking to the system and how the system can be turned to do that. But I suppose it's such a no-brainer that that's what all of our magisteria should be doing, and yet typically they don't. They become magisterias and then they hold forth. How to go about it, church and state, but how to sustain the hope along the way?
Well, I think organisation is very important, to get organised. Take Canon 212.3. When I go back, I'm currently studying in Rome. I go back to Rome now in November, trying to get a small group who will start to work on how we can effectively use Canon 212 as a group. What do we do? Who do we write to? Who do we tell? Who are our sacred pastors? What is appropriate? In other words, start to put shape on this canon, and how we can put shape on it. Because as I look at the structure of the church currently, we have this huge, some people describe it as a pyramid. God, it's not really a pyramid. Pyramids actually, have a graduated, there's no pyramid. What we have is a huge plinth, this massive, massive big plinth. There's 1.2 billion of us stuck in the plinth. And then we have this tiny kind of little needle that sticks up out of the plinth. And that needle, that kind of, anyway, there it is. Right, that's something like that. Actually, no, it's more like that. That's what it is. Now, I'm never going to be in that bit. Never, ever, ever. Why? Why am I never going to be in that bit? Because I'm a woman, right? The only bit that I'm ever going to get to be in is this bit, this massive big plinth where we all just wobble around talking to each other and giving out yards about things, but we never, ever, ever get in here. And the structure from then we've got this bit's layers, of course. You've got the cleric, you've got those. It's all got to do with ordination. Everybody in this bit's ordained. At the very top, you have the Pope. Then below him, you have the College of Bishops, supposed to be with him, but below him actually. And then below that, the clergy, and all forms of decision making. All forms of decision making really are predicated upon being part of this bit. This tiny little needle, and so it's a nonsense really, because what we really need to do, here are all these people with views, with their own spirituality, with their experience of God, with their experience of love and life, with their experience of marriage, their experience of relationships, their experience of rearing children. Does anybody listen to them? I mean, I've sat in class, doing canon law about marriage, the only married person in the class. Do you think anybody would ask me my opinion? No, why? I don't count. My opinion doesn't count. My experience doesn't count. It has no place really to go. And I think the work of this educated generation, the first really massively educated laity that we've had, is to insist, absolutely insist, on places and spaces where our voices can be given the dignity of being heard. In fact, we've had the opposite for the last two. We've had the opposite for the last two popes. The space, every time we've tried to open up a discussion, we've been told, no, the magisterium already has spoken on that subject is closed. Women in priesthood, for example, even women in diaconate, which should not be closed. But neither of them, in my view, should be closed, but certainly that one should be wide open. So here we had Pope Paul VI asking at the council, where are the other 50%? What do you mean, where are the other 50%? They're not there because you didn't ask them. They don't belong to that bit. They didn't get asked. That's why they weren't there. Why didn't they do something about it? And I think that we really have to provoke with indignation and a determination that human dignity demands that this structure, this exclusion of women and many men, incidentally, also, from having a voice that is based on experience, a voice that that is part and parcel of the process of revelation, that their own contribution to revelation is wasted. So I think that we get organised is what we do, and we also, we just don't take it. I think there's a great phrase again from my favourite poem of Seamus Heaney's, from the Canton of Expectation, where he talks about standing your ground. Standing your ground, not being intimidated, not being frightened to say your piece, and at times, to regard yourself as someone who, has something of value to say, and to refuse to accept that because the structure says that you are of less worth. I think that's one of the great things that I've always been very grateful for, that I never ever thought of myself as a person of less worth. I never thought of myself as a person who had more worth than anyone else, but I never thought of myself as someone who had less worth than anyone. And I think that's an important place to start, with the equality of the human person. So that's what I would hope, that this coming generation, and perhaps Pope Francis may open that door to us, whether he does or whether he doesn't, I think we should be kicking it anyway. And we shouldn't be letting them off with keeping doors closed that we think should be opened. It is, after all, our church. It is, by virtue of baptism, it is our church. And I mean, I get terribly upset to see that church abused by power struggles. One of the worst episodes in my life, one of the ones that broke my heart and gave me a lot of grief, happened here in this city when I came as president, and I went to visit Cardinal Law in the great big house not too far from here, which no longer belongs, of course, to the Archdiocese, but now belongs to the university here. Yes. Yeah, all things come to those who wait. Yeah, God is good. And anyway, to cut a very long story short, I went to thank him for the work that he had done and the generosity that he had always shown to the Irish immigrant community. And having done that, and we had a pleasant conversation, his attitude changed literally in a split second. And he was unbelievably rude to myself and my team. He told me that he despaired for Catholic Ireland to have it led by a woman such as me, and to have another minister who was with me who was a woman, and a woman such as her in government. And I asked him what he meant by that. And because I said to him that I was not the president of Catholic Ireland, that there was no such phenomenon, that there is an Ireland that is made up of Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Hindu, atheist, and none of the above. And I was their president. They had elected me. And I was, of course, in my own life a Catholic. But I had not been elected to deliver a Catholic agenda. That's for the bishops, not for me. And I deliver a Catholic agenda in my own home to my kids, while they were under 18. But after that, it wasn't my role as a president to do that. And I was deeply hurt by what he said. And I asked him why, and he said it was because of the views I had expressed before I became president, though I never expressed them as president, because it would have been inappropriate. My views on women in priesthood. And he was unbelievably rude. And to do that, I think I don't think he would have done it to a male head of state. I'm perfectly sure that he wouldn't have done it to a male head of state. And I who had lost my home because I was a Catholic, my father and my brother had been the targets of attempted murders because they were Catholic. Any day of the week, it would have been easier to convert to Buddhism, Protestantism, any other damnism, and to save your life. And I could have done that any day of the week. But I chose to stay within my faith and to make my stand there. And to have this awful man dare to describe me as a bad Catholic. I'm not a perfect Catholic by any manner of means, but I'll tell you something, and this is what really bothered me. In 1972, 74, a good friend of mine, a Catholic, became a rare phenomenon, a judge in Northern Ireland. Catholic judges were as rare as hen's teeth, and they were also immediately targets from their own side, from the IRA, a Catholic paramilitary organization, which was at that time, very hostile to the idea of any Catholic taking a job with what was seen as the oppressive establishment. Anyway, my friend took the job because, like me, he believed, worry the goddamn space, do what you can in there, get in there and try and change. His name was Rory Conaghan. And the day he was made a judge, I met him, and we were joking him and saying, oh God, you'll have to move to a compound now, and get all this security. And he just said to us, he said, no, he said, I know that. He said, but actually, he said, there's only one protection I need. He said, and the only one protection is of any use to me. He said, I just keep my soul in a constant state of grace. And we kind of smiled at him. And anyway, very short time later, he was murdered coming out of Mass. And I've always remembered that. And because I remembered it, it's been my own leitmotif all of my life to try and keep my soul in a constant state of grace. Why? Because I don't know. It could be a boss, a terrorist, whatever. And to have this cardinal tell me that I was a bad Catholic because I expressed a view on an issue that's a topic of general discourse, that showed me exactly what you're talking about, Tom. This thinking from the top down, that the certitude that a bunch of celibate men sitting in their offices, talking to each other, can dare to presume that they know everything, about everything, and tell me what to think and you what to think. and how to think it and in what circumstances. And I just simply refused, point blank. Having made every effort, incidentally, to read all the theology on women in priesthood and being less than impressed by the scholarly nature of the best of the writing, the best of it now. I'm happy to stand up and say I've read it and it's unconvincing.
So I'll confess that I'm not a Catholic, not Irish either, but I.
God, you lucky person.
I am Jewish. We have our own problems. But I find myself very moved by what you say, and I'm particularly intrigued by the efficacy and the grace, for lack of a better word, with which you've worked within the tradition that you were raised in. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit. I'm sure you've had contacts and connections and organizing opportunities with people of other faiths and traditions where you've been able to take some of these insights and work with them in those traditions as well. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of those opportunities in Islam maybe, or with Orthodox Jews, because there are other similar structures, not only in religious institutions, I suppose, you could find it in political structures as well, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about
We have
what
a
you
very,
know outside.
very small Jewish population in Ireland. I lived actually, my school was right next door to the synagogue, but they were a terribly small population, and they benefited from the fact that the Christians were so busy bashing each other that nobody took one blind bit of notice of the Jewish population, who were a mighty bastion of cultural sanity in a country that really wasn't a bastion of sanity. My main work in the early days, I've always been involved in anti-sectarianism, and the Irish Council of Churches, which represents the Protestant churches and the Catholic Church separately, asked me to undertake commissioned me to write on the subject of sectarianism and what the churches could do about sectarianism, like as if it wasn't their problem, But anyway, so I did that. And I wrote along with it, and we got a group of people together, a group from right across the political and the religious divide. And I think at the end of it, we had some absolutely searing discussions now. Discussions that would almost strip the skin from you. The rawness of hatred poured onto the table. But when we started, we said we would try and be honest with one another, because when you live in a divided community, you learn dishonesty very quickly. I mean, you have to deal with people every day in shops or in workplaces or in school, not so much in school because our schools are very segregated, but at university. So you learn the language of never ever getting below the surface, that's always superficial. But it was very important to us that we were able to get beyond the superficial and get to the real meat, and we did. And that experience stood to me. Because one of the things I learned about it was that Catholic minds and Protestant minds are two very, very different things. And I'm sure Jewish minds the same again. I always wondered why whenever we sat down to negotiate, negotiations always fell apart immediately. In the Protestant mind, roughly speaking, words have a meaning. One meaning. That's the meaning. In the Catholic mind, well, you could elasticate it this way, that way, the other way. So you go into negotiations, Protestants go in with here's the bottom line, and there is no plan B. Catholics go in with, here's the bottom line, but we could maybe have a plan A, B, C, D in it. And the Protestants think, well, that is just typical Catholic now, very Jesuitical. You can't trust a word they say, because the words are always they might mean this today, they might mean that yesterday, and how do we know what they really mean? And meanwhile, the Catholics are saying, well, if that isn't just typical of Protestants, they come in here and they're so rigid and they're so stubborn, they only have one view, and it's their view. And so we wondered why we always broke down, and it was because we never bothered to give each other the dignity of finding out the different thought processes that inform us. And we spent a good bit of time I spent personally a good bit of time researching that, and trying to look at the otherness of the other, so that I could grow an awareness of these neighbours that I lived cheek by jowl with, who incidentally weren't going anywhere. I wasn't going anywhere. If we were going to repeat history, we were going to offer our kids perpetual conflict, but we had to start doing something different. Otherwise, we were going to keep on repeating the conflict. And I didn't want my kids and my grandkids growing up with a perpetuation of conflict. And we had to do exactly as you were saying. We had to bridge the gaps, the chasms of what somebody called the centuries of arrears, of history's arrears. And I pledged myself to building bridges for the 14 years that I was president, and set out down the road of trying to draw into discourse and dialogue the very people from whom we were estranged. And strangely enough, it was very helpful that in Dublin we had already begun to develop around our, civic sort of iconic moments like the presidency, the inauguration, that we had started to draw in. They'd always been very Catholic events in the past, to be honest, overwhelmingly so, really. But we started to make them events that where our Jewish, our rabbi and our Jewish and our Muslim imams made their contribution, our humanists made their contribution. So we'd started already to develop a new discourse around who was included in the notion of being Irish, Irish identity, Irish. And we started to break down the notion that, Irish means Catholic, means Irish nationalist, We'd started to break that, to refine that. And I think we're on a journey to refining that. We're only at the start of these journeys. I mean, you're so lucky you live in these environments where all these things are on the table. But a decade ago, a generation ago, they weren't. So the important thing for me is to remember to keep the foot on the pedal of these things. I was very taken by what Cardinal Koch said. I went to his Nostra Aetate lecture in Rome last year, and I came out of it in tears. When he talked, because he's responsible for Jewish-Catholic relationships, and he just said plain and straight that the 2,000-year teaching of anti-Semitism outcropped in the Shoah, and we can't walk away from that reality, though many would like to deny it. And the fact that he was frank enough to just say it out loud, I was ashamed of my church, ashamed of what it taught. And yes, we have many episodes and instances of people who did the good thing, the gospel of love, who helped. But what we have to remember is the toxic spores of hatred that were taught from generation to generation that fueled the hatred and contempt for a whole swathe of people with that label Jew. And we have to make sure that in the coming generations that we do nothing to help those toxic spores, because believe me, they have a shelf life that is damn scary. They have a really scary shelf life. And what helps them to continue is you and I sitting in company and somebody making an a homophobic remark, a remark against women, a remark about Catholics, a remark about Jews, and that is nasty. Maybe funny, but downright damn nasty. And if we sit there and smile, where does the word go? It keeps on traveling. It keeps on traveling. So we have to be the people who stand against that word, In my view, we have to be the people who say, as I have done with my clerical colleagues, to my regret, I have met so many homophobic clerics in Rome. It's scary, absolutely scary. Many of them, may I say, from the United States of America, absolutely horrific, and who think nothing in company of making homophobic remarks, and then are stunned when I say, excuse me, I will not sit in this company and take that kind of language. That language is dangerous. That language is nasty. I wouldn't take it from anybody, but I'm damned if I'll take it from pastors. And so, there is a way of stopping the toxin, and it's one person at a time, in my view. And that's how we work. That's how I've always worked. In the presidency, we worked, at the level of, my husband spent 14 years on a phone, phoning people who were involved in paramilitarism and Protestant paramilitarism, the kind of people who put both he and I out of our home, people who came in through his front door, took the Sacred Heart picture off the wall and stamped on it, broke the glass and ruined it, people who came and put us out of our home, who emptied the contents of 2 submachine guns into my home, who attacked my younger brother, who's profoundly deaf, and tried to kill him. These are the people. I should have, by right, I suppose I should have hated them. I just wanted to show them love, and I wanted to show them that there was a possibility and a potential for friendship. I also wanted to figure out, does this commandment work? If we live it, does this command? I said to my husband, going in through the door of the president's house, the first when we were just elected, I was just elected, I said, let's see if this damn commandment works. To love one another, and 14 years later, I can say with absolute certainty it does. That if you outreach to that that person who is the other, whom you mistrust, distrust, have contempt for, are afraid of, have reason to dislike, in my direct experience, there is a well of humanity somewhere in that person, and enough in you that there will be an opportunity for friendship. Not necessarily a meeting of minds, not necessarily agreement on anything, but enough to build a friendship. And that to me has been the most important journey in my life, to build the friendships, to listen while people tell their story.
In the back here?
Hi, Cinco. So there's a Baptist group in Topeka, Kansas called the Westboro Baptist Church. You may probably heard of them. But they are a group who propagates hate slurs against people in the LGBT community, saying stuff like God hates fags and that. I really won't go into all of them. But how do you address people who have, I use quotes, these religious, deeply religious arguments against homosexuals? Who believe that they are using the scripture for good interpretation?
I think, well, frankly, I think anybody who propagates hate should be prosecuted. That's the first thing. I think we need to have an infrastructure that clearly sets out the rights of human beings. Beg your pardon, doesn't set out the rights, vindicates the pre-existing God-given rights of human beings. So I think that one of the great things that we have done in the peace process in Ireland is to underpin our peace with a really strong legal architecture, a framework that vindicates the rights of all human beings, all citizens, to what we call parity of esteem, so that those who propagate hate will be told in a court, I don't care where your views derive from, a little bit of discrimination is not allowed. A little bit of hatred is not allowed. You are. So I do think actually that we do have to tackle this issue of hatred in a number of ways. First of all, by continuing the discourse. But when we see hatred and when we hear hatred, we have to be capable of saying that has crossed a line. Allowing people freedom of speech, absolutely, but not the freedom to create an environment that is, if you like, an incubator for toxic spores that will result in some young gay man being headbutted, some young gay kid feeling that he has to commit suicide because he is too frightened to walk his own streets, to live his life on his own terms. So, frankly, I think we have to hit all of those things in a number of ways. And one of the things we have to do is to stand foursquare against hatred, the promulgation of hatred. And that's where I would pitch myself. And also engaging in, for example, academic discourse. I think academics and scholars have a big job here to do, particularly in the fields of, of theology and a kind of a social theology, if you like, in trying to explain to people how does this sit with the gospel of love your neighbour, that great commandment to love one another, constantly engaging in the hope of persuading, because people are persuadable. People are. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be bothered having been president of Ireland, and I wouldn't have been bothered being involved in the campaign for gay rights if I didn't think that the human person was capable of change. I've changed my views on so many things over the years and been persuaded by people who had a much better grip on things than I had. And so I do think that, the politics of persuasion, of discourse, but also of drawing a line and not permitting certain things to be said publicly without penalty.
Yes.
Hi.
Can you stand up?
Oh, sure. Hi. Thank you so much for coming. I think your talk has been really inspirational to everyone here. I'm curious, given your time that you've spent so far in Boston and your time in Ireland, if you've seen any differences or similarities in the LGBT movements between the two countries and what you've drawn from that.
I'm probably not well enough read on the life and times of the LGBT community here, to be honest, because I I just haven't, I'm just not, in fact, Paul brought me up to speed yesterday on it, and I was shocked to hear what your stats are here, you know, in terms of support, for example, for gay marriage, but going in the right direction, in my view, because I'm a very strong supporter of gay marriage. And so we in Ireland are, we are so far down the line here. That is not to say we've solved the problem, incidentally. It's not to say that we do not have people who speak in hateful terms about gays, but that there are still people who still cannot walk the street because they're afraid of attack. All of that. But still underpinning it, we have a community, a thinking community, which has already made up its mind that to be gay is to be perfectly normal. That there is nothing abnormal about being a gay person. That this is part of the spectrum of normal human sexual identity. And I'd say 90% of the Irish population believe that. In relation to how that translates then into a legal infrastructure, I think we're on the way to developing that with gay partnership and in time, gay marriage. Where I think we are probably worryingly, where there are lacunae, is in relation to the question of religious freedom. Yes, the religious freedom of any group to express its religious views. But if I go back to the issue of education in Ireland, I don't know what it is like here. As I mentioned, particularly in the Republic of Ireland, though it's also true in the North, the vast majority of young children will be educated in Catholic schools. So if you're a teacher, your biggest job opportunities in a Catholic school. What if you're a gay man or woman? Now, I know many gay men and women who teach in Catholic schools, and nobody says a word. It's very much they don't ask, don't tell. The problems that I see for the future are when they decide to have a gay partnership. How does the school respond then? Or further down the line, if there's gay marriage, how does that? Because obviously at that point, they now become much more openly, consciously at odds with the church's magisterium. Now, in my view, the magisterium is lagging very far behind where the public wants it to go in this matter. And the church has never been a champion, really, never a champion of women's rights, never a champion of gay rights, pretty much way behind the curve. And I would just be worried that we have not yet got a framework for dealing with those kind of problems. But they are lurking. And because we don't do anything about them says something about where the sensitivities are. But at the end of the day, it's not enough not just to do nothing about them. I think we need clarity because people still are living their lives in a kind of a subterranean world. I imagine many people are not taking advantage of gay partnership precisely because they don't want to draw that attention to themselves. So here's a new civic right that offers them the opportunity for a different kind of life, but there are other inhibitors, that are preventing the full realization of their human potential, and that worries me.
We have time for one last comment or
I
question.
just wanted to ask, thank you so much, this is fantastic. Here in the United States, of course, we have several groups that are working for reform in the church. Do you belong to any organization yourself working for reform in the church?
No, I don't. I'm just doing my own little thing. I'm a one-person group at the minute. And I decided, years ago, I was involved in an organization called Brothers and Sisters in Christ, BASIC it's called, which is an organization that lobbies for women in priesthood. And I would still be a very strong supporter. But during the years of the presidency, it was important that I wouldn't belong to lobby groups. It's a completely inappropriate thing. And I also felt coming out of the presidency that it would be important not to belong to lobby groups for the time being, that I have my own agenda, if you like, and that I would, where I could, that I would assist. And for example, as when I go back to Rome now, I'm talking to groups of religious about how they can best use the Code of Canon Law to get their voices heard. I was shocked when the first meetings I had with them in Rome. These are all highly experienced missionaries. These are people who would just wow you with their life's experience. They're wonderful, wonderful people. They never heard of Canon 2.1, 2.3. But they all have opinions, and they want those opinions known. So I'm going to go talk to them now in November about how they can get organised. I won't be part of any organisation as such for the time being. I have an agenda for myself. I want to finish this work on children's rights. There's nobody else writing in this area really. And as my supervisor, or at least one of my my then dean said to me, I said to him, why is there nobody writing in this field? And he said, you'd really have to be doing that yourself now. It would have to be a lay person would be doing that. You know, if you were looking to be a bishop now, for example, you wouldn't be writing that kind of stuff. He said, in jest, jokingly, of course. And I said, well, what kind of stuff like would you get? I mean, what kind of people come with what kind of proposals do you get for theses? And he said, well, the last one through the door was a very worthy young man who wanted to write a thesis on Mary as the fourth person in the Trinity. So, yes. What can one say? So obviously when I plod in and talk about, you know, children's rights and canon law, it's a different ballgame altogether. And that's where I want to go, and I want to write in that field. And I want to try and develop it because the Church, thankfully, is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Unlike the United States.
Yeah, that makes it part of this burgeoning discourse on children's rights, which we've never really had in the Church, and which we need to have now. We need to start looking at children very, very differently. We take away their right to consent at baptism, you know, infant baptism, and we give them no opportunity really to consent. We presume that they will remain faithful to the Church, and indeed we penalise in many ways any decision that they might make to leave the Church. So I'm trying to look at baptism now in a different light, trying to focus in on the fact that at baptism it's perfectly feasible to be baptised as an infant, but not necessarily to have your denomination at baptism decided for you. To break open that contract, that so-called christening contract, into its component parts. So the lawyer in me wants to explore these avenues, which will, I'm sure, endear me greatly to that crowd.
Thank you so very much, Mary.